want to dedicate our session this morning to the memory, the life, and the legacy of Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed yesterday. A real contemplative light gone out in the world that leaves behind a beautiful legacy of teachings on mindfulness and contemplative practice for people of many different traditions around the world. So we hold him in our prayer as he makes his transition. And Benum Christinet, let us pray. May I learn to look upon myself with the eyes of understanding and love. May I learn to look upon you with the eyes of understanding and love. May I learn to look upon all with the eyes of understanding and love. So our first reading today can be found on page 12 for those of you who have the book and would like to follow. I'm sorry, 112. Self-examination leads not to self-deprecation, but to gratitude for God who, quote, proves his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, from Romans 5:8. In the vacuum left by our failure to examine ourselves, the egotistical lie of our autonomy stands ready to rush in, projecting our moral failures onto others in order to avoid the hypocrisies we cannot bear in ourselves. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye, says Jesus in Matthew 7:5. The ascetic thus knows better than anyone that the cross is the judgment of judgment. Stripped of their capacity to judge, only compassion remains. Exposing the ills of society does not then come from a place of judgment, but from solidarity with those who suffer, particularly at the hands of their own demons. Let us pray. Our second reading this morning spans from 112 to 114. It's a rather long paragraph with a citation. As we move into a deeper solidarity with others, contemplation does not shield us from a broken heart, but commits us to a lifetime of broken hearts. As we live more deeply into our deified nature, we live with increasing compassion for others. The lines between ourselves and others are blurred the more we realize we are but a part of the whole. Each of us is but a single member of Christ's body. As this spiritual awareness takes root in one's spiritual consciousness, it gradually counteracts the demonic distortion by which the part of something is mistaken for the whole. To die to oneself is not only to live for an abstract resurrected Christ, but to live for Christ in you. The more one recognizes that all are members of Christ's body, the less one is able to see another's suffering apart from their own. To harm another is to harm oneself. To judge another is to condemn oneself. As Evagrius of Pontus observed, a contemplative is someone who considers himself as one with all because he unceasingly thinks he sees himself in everyone. Thus, For the sanctified person, the underlying motivation for the golden rule is no longer ethical, it is spiritual, but so too is it logical. Once we recognize others as inseparable from ourselves in Christ, where is the wisdom in causing them harm? The sanctified person is someone no longer separated, and he is only sanctified to the extent that he understands in practice that he is no longer separated from anyone or anything. He bears humanity in himself, all human beings in their passion and their resurrection. He is identified in Christ with the whole Adam. His own self no longer interests him. He includes in his prayer and his love all humanity, without judging or condemning anyone except himself, the last of all. He is infinitely vulnerable to the horror of the world, to the tragedies of history being constantly renewed. But he is crushed with Christ and rises again with him, with everyone. He knows that resurrection has the last word, and that deeper than horror is the joy. We cannot know authentic joy or inner tranquility by rising above the suffering of others, but by entering into the source of our own suffering in solidarity with others. This is the way of Christ, the Paschal mystery. To bear humanity in oneself is to identify with all humanity in our shared suffering and in the promise of resurrection. To judge and condemn oneself, according to Clement, is to examine with fierce honesty our own vulnerability at the hands of our demons. It is to recognize we are so caught up in their tenacious demands that there is no room to judge another. The perception that one is separate and therefore somehow morally superior to another is the greatest obstacle to one's ability to identify in Christ with the whole of humanity. And that is precisely the obstacle our demons strive to keep firmly in place. Let us pray. May I learn to identify the sources of anger, craving, and delusion in myself. May you learn to identify the sources of anger, craving, and delusion in yourself. May they learn to identify the sources of anger, craving, and delusion in themselves. Thich Nhat Hanh. So good morning, everyone. That was a long and packed reading, particularly the second half of that, but it didn't make sense to break it up over the span of a week. So I tried to hold that together for us today. So as always, you have the floor. We'll just take a few moments of quiet and see what bubbles up. Hi there, David. Good morning. David, you want to just go ahead and unmute there?
I don't come thinking I'm going to share something, but this reading has brought back a memory from many years ago in which, let me tell you the story. I had a sabbatical in 1998, and I wanted to go to some place in the world that was hurting. And the Presbyterian Church had a trip to Croatia and Bosnia Herzegovina called The Aftermath of War. And after about 4 days of looking at all the mass graves and hearing the stories and the stories of hate that had been broadcast all the time, and I was at breakfast and I began to weep. And there was a strange reason why I was weeping. I heard the stories about the Serbs who would go into a little village and they would tell a neighbor, give them a knife and tell them to kill their Muslim neighbor. And if they didn't do it, they would kill them, and then they'd go to the next one. And by they got to number 4, they were, and I was weeping, but my weeping was not for those who've been killed. It was for those who had so debased the image of God in themselves in causing these murders to take place. And these paragraphs today just kind of brought that back. It was almost as though the Christ in me was weeping for those who had been the perpetrators of the evil. And so I just wanted to share that story with you.
Thanks, David. It's very powerful. And I think it's anecdotal of what all of this is in its most egregious forms when we fail to sort of do that inner work of grappling with our own shadow. As Thich Nhat Hanh says in that sort of closing prayer, we have to really, spend time grappling with where anger arises or resentments arise, or that division of understanding the wholeness of all things, the unity of all things. When that gets fractured in our perception and our projections, you can see it's not just a, how can I explain it? It's not just a spiritual inconvenience. I mean, it really does lead to a kind of evil that you're weeping about in that instance. It's serious. It's not just a small little quaint exercise that we do.
Thank you.
I've been asked if I could share on the screen. I hope people don't mind. I know that was a long reading, so as people speak, I'll try to hold this up for a little bit, and then we'll turn to Richard's question, trying to make as much of that fit as possible. Richard, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, all. Seeing this on the screen, I'm reminded that during my during the meditation period, I sometimes think it would be helpful for me if the first reading was left on the screen. I don't know how others feel. Perhaps I should dig out the book. The second reading at the very end has demons striving. And that's my question is about that. But first, an anecdote of my time with Thich Nhat Hanh. I started recording Thai in San Francisco before there was a Plum Village. And I was backstage, and he was about 30 foot from me, center stage. And he had a little tape recorder in his pocket that Sister True Happiness had given him to record himself. And he noticed me backstage all breathless, trying to get a good recording of him, and fussing with my tape recorder and jamming the tape in, and breathless, literally breathless in my work. And he noticed, and he reached for the little tape recorder in his pocket, took it out, took the tape out, and said, "Breathing in, take out tape. Breathing out, turn tape over." So he gave me personal instruction in walking peacefully through my work. I'm also reminded of his secretary, Therese, who was responsible to answer the phones. And it grew to be many phones. And she would bristle when on stage he would say, when the telephone rings, the first ring, pause and listen. It's a meditation bell. The second, breathe. On the third ring, you answer it and you can say, hello. And she was just bristling because she had 4 phones going. And that's just some early reports of Thich Nhat Hanh. The second reading about demons, maybe my demons cause me to think there's no demons. Maybe my demons do strive. But the idea that demons have a identity, a consciousness, and a striving, an intention, maybe like Screw Tape Letters and C.S. Lewis, that these demons have intention and their own volition to obstruct any opening in my own heart. Could you address the will of demons and how that serves the whole?
Thanks, Richard. I might suggest you refresh your memory on the first few pages where I actually explore that question as to whether or not we're speaking about spiritual entities with will and volition. I don't use those exact terms, but you'll see the point. Or if we're naming psychological tendencies, cravings that come up in us. And in many ways, I'm not sure that it matters whether we're speaking about actual spiritual entities with will and desire and intention, or if we're dealing with what we might psychologically call inner woundedness and cravings that unmet needs that end up getting calcified, or whose energy within us drives us towards certain fulfillment of perceived lacking, perceived absences. In many ways, regardless of how each of us understands that, I think the approach remains the same: to name it, to identify it, to sort of recognize the way it's functioning in you. And in doing that, you can, on some level, objectify it or segregate it from who your integrated whole self is. You can see it as something that can be named, identified, maybe concretized in some level, and in doing so, understand it better. If we want to say it, the dynamic in you toward habitual behaviors that are self-destructive or selfish or harmful to others, or whatever that case, whatever that is in you. That's what I'm trying to refer to. So I don't know, in my own spiritual life, the jury is out on how we should think about demons. And I state that in the opening line of this very chapter. But I think, again, the approach to them is the same: to recognize, to do what the Eastern Fathers called in the Orthodox Church watchfulness, to watch your thoughts, to watch the dynamics in you, and so on. And if you go back to your anecdotal story of Thich Nhat Hanh, he's asking, in a sense, for that same thing. When the phone rings, watch, notice. That's a meditation bell calling you to be centered. Be aware of how there's somebody on the other end of that phone that is calling for your presence. How will you be present to them? And what's stopping you? What's the frustration? Why are you gritting your teeth? Breathe, become present. Notice your posture in that moment so that you can name it, put it aside, and be present to whoever's on the other end of that telephone. I mean, in a sense, that's an anecdote for the whole active life of contemplative practice. How to get out of the way, whatever's in the way, so that I can be present to whatever's before me.
Lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome, Richard. And good morning, Jason.
Good morning, Father Vincent. My question is this. I'm not, this might have to do with it. If you're familiar with the Enneagram, I'm a 4 with a 5 wing, I'm pretty sure. And I come from like a dysfunctional family background. I think a lot of people do. I probably do have PTSD. I was in therapy for a while. But my question is during our sits, our contemplative prayer sits, right? Sometimes a lot of memories come up, but I just return to my sacred image, or my sacred word, sacred image. But I noticed that, and it's like it's like my brain's always moved to monkey mind, right? This stream of consciousness. It's always bringing stuff up from the past, but I'm learning to kind of like not to really engage it, right? Not to resist it, but not to engage it necessarily, but just let it play out and then come back to my sacred image, my sacred word. But I'm wondering what what you're thinking would be about if we have PTSD and how contemplative prayer what I mean is I hope I'm not just wasting my time just sitting there letting the images come to me, especially for my past, my childhood, my teenagers. I'm in my 40s.
Mhm.
So do you kind of get what I'm saying a little bit?
I do. I do. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. It's a great question. So I always would want to advise. I love Father Keating's analogy that when ideas or images or sort of brain junk comes up during your meditation, he says it's like taking out the trash. You don't when you sort of tie up your kitchen trash bag to take out to the curb, you don't go through it and sift through everything in that bag and wonder, oh, what did I throw in there 3 days ago and what's still there? You just tie it up and throw it out to the curb, essentially. And his basic approach is that's what we should be doing with what comes up in our prayers, sort of just wrapping it up and letting it go. But I do think there is a caveat to that. If you're dealing, so two things, if the types of distractions that you're finding in your meditation are the simple run-of-the-mill disconnected ideas that are just flying around, stream of consciousness, then I think certainly we can tie those up and let them go. It's just your brain being, as you say, puppy mind, or kind of having fun or finding itself bored with what you're asking it to do. This is very normal. If, on the other hand, you have a persistent type of distraction, something specific coming up from PTSD or painful childhood memories or traumatic experiences, I would want to advise that persistent sense of that coming up for you on a regular basis, where it's not just randomized brain junk, but something very particular, pointed, and repetitive. That I think is your subconsciousness or your consciousness is asking you to attend to that on some level, that there's something there that's more than just wild brain junk, but a wound that needs addressing. And then I would say not to, as long as it's not sending you into a depression or a tailspin, you can maintain that practice. And during the practice, you can just keep, as you say, disengage, let it go, let it move on. But outside of the meditation, I think that distraction that's persistent is telling you something that needs your attention, whether that's through therapy or talking with a friend or some kind of medical advice, whatever that may be on a professional level. I would recommend that you do both in tandem. That for the meditation, you practice letting it go. Outside of the meditation, you find ways to address what's going on.
Would you recommend something like I know some therapists recommend like imaginal work that would be outside of the contemplative prayer, when you like engage the memories, like, you know what I mean, like whatever comes of consciousness, you settle down, basically, you get quiet, restful, and then you try to go back to it and kind of engage it. I don't know if that would be good or that'd be dangerous, like
I would
imagination.
say, yep. And I would say that if you're going to do that, you would do so under the supervision of some kind of a therapist who can walk you through that until they can help sort of take off those training wheels and lead and feel that you have enough sort of inner stamina to deal with that individually. But always when you're dealing with trauma, especially as it comes out through your prayer life or meditation, it's a signal to address it. And whether
Yeah.
imagination type therapies or exposure therapies work, I think they could, and they
Yeah.
all have value, but you want to make sure you're doing that with a qualified person, right? A therapist or someone who can really
Right.
walk you through that.
And one last thing about that, when the memories come up, I notice, like Father Keating said, they come up for healing, like for healing, to take out the trash for healing. But it's like the wounds come up, right, with the memories, and sometimes they're strong, not always, but I think they come up though to be like alchemized, right? Like because Jesus had his wounds still when he resurrected, so maybe they come up for alchemy or for cauterization, to be cauterized or alchemized. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think
Memories,
when they're coming
yeah,
up there, what it is you're seeking, you're tending toward and seeking wholeness. You're seeking to heal the wound
yeah,
in some way, just the way the body will, all of
yeah,
its own accord, sort of heal a physical wound in this most miraculous way. There's a there's a desire within you psychologically to heal those
yeah.
wounds, and it's tending toward that. And the question is to help pave the way for that healing to unfold.
Right, right. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I got it.
Okay, thank you, Jason. I appreciate that. Marianne, please. Marianne, you'll just want to unmute if that's okay. Yep, there you
I always forget that. This is the first time I'm joining you. I actually took your retreat when you were at Metkin.
go. Oh, how
Uh,
nice.
you know, and actually trying to catch up a little bit through YouTube on some of your beginnings. But it's really to join it today is really poignant because first of all, the phone rang this morning. I'm in New York, and it was my friend who's attending her dying father.
Mm,
You know, and dealing with family dysfunctions over everybody's perception of what's happening. And she has two very difficult siblings. But the term that came up in my head was scapegoat. That oftentimes we take in, and even for ourselves, the projections of other people's issues.
mhm,
And you know, and if we're centered in terms of what is Christ sending to us at that point, what is he asking us or me to synthesize at that point, to
mhm,
realize what people are processing, or what I'm processing is neither good nor bad, it's where they are, and to stay out of the judgment of that. And so anyway, that was the thought that came up. The second thing was when we do a self-examination, and I guess I'm in the first chapters of you, to not just look at our negatives, but to look at the positives things in here. That and if we refocus what we're trying to deal with and realize there's something good in me that is processing this, that it adds another dimension into it. So I don't know what I usually don't say anything. That's the funny part. But I don't know if that scapegoat is a good image, but I think, it is an image that is used oftentimes in scripture, that the pig goes running away because the demons have been placed on it. So
right.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. And thank you for sharing this morning. Yeah, I think that, in a word, just scapegoating is what happens when we don't do the inner work that I'm suggesting in these paragraphs. And that relates to your kind of your second comment. I agree with you. One of the earlier in the book, I define humility as the ability to see the truth about oneself and admit it. And I think we all have a more difficult time admitting what is good about ourselves because we're taught that's prideful or arrogant or self-centered or narcissistic, when in fact there is a healthy acknowledgement that we all, I think, have to walk ourselves through, which is what gifts do I have to offer? And there's almost an ethical mandate, I think, that we do that work of acknowledging the goodness, as you're saying, because there's a community who needs whatever that is. It's not a gift given just for ourselves, but for the, as we'll hear in the readings from St. Paul this coming Sunday, tomorrow, every member of the body of Christ has a purpose and a point. So what is that? What is that goodness? As it happens, because of the nature of this venue, we're reading through this particular chapter at a glacial, as all of them, at a glacial pace. So there seems to be a prolonged emphasis on seeing only the bad, but that's because it's only this section of the book that we're on now, this chapter. But if you see it in its larger context, I make that case very strongly that there, part of the spiritual life is to discern what is good in us, and to do that again for the benefit of the larger community of which we're a part. So I appreciate you're making sure we kind of hold that perspective in mind.
I was a chaplain for many years in the hospital. And I had no problem seeing Christ in others, and what, and who you visited, what was he trying to say to me? Right. And the gift that people brought to me in terms of understanding and the nature of suffering and the nature of pain and the nature of whatever. And, but then, I've retired. And so now it's really, where is Christ in me? And to look at, the anger or, the frustrations, and not get caught up in them. And this is what my friend, I said, as her brother and sister are emoting, realize that they're just in a space, and it's not you, that it's not, you're the goodness of you still, you're still God's beloved, no matter what they're doing, and just be aware of that. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Mary. Jessica, please.
Good morning, Father. Good morning, everybody. I thank you for letting me speak. I actually read this section last night, and I was just very moved and did a lot of writing about it. But my husband and I think I've shared with the group before, that we have a charity that we kind of fund and just do, and it really is just us walking the streets. And it was in Seattle. It's now here in Richmond, Virginia, where we are now. And we feed homeless and we spend time with them. And I work a full-time job, so I haven't been as active in that, but my husband just commits himself to it. He's a true contemplative. And we live a very modest life. We have a very small apartment kind of in front of the seminary where he goes to school, and he works and studies in. And I've noticed that with this practice of going out and spending time with the poor, it becomes harder and harder to spend on ourselves. And we spend a lot of time shopping for supplies to hand out. And my husband's really the rock. I definitely will say that. I won't take credit, but I noticed that I, on the other hand, sorry, my thoughts are kind of everywhere, but I work at a private school. And so I am surrounded by students and faculty that are very privileged. And I think in this practice that we have been doing, I notice a more difficult time having some of the conversations with my faculty colleagues about things like travel and experiences, and especially after the holidays, because we do live such a modest life here, and we try to give to people, which wasn't always that way. But, in the reading, the reason I'm bringing this up is because of the judgment part. And I don't want to seem like I'm judging my colleagues, but I sometimes find it so difficult to spend on myself, and to hear about these extravagant trips that they take to the Galapagos Islands. I'm like, wow, there are so many people who are eating or not eating outside, or living outside, or just, in difficult conditions. I just have a difficult time in this conversation. I don't know how else to say it. And, in that judgment, that I'm reflecting upon myself, and I don't want to be judgmental, because this is my decision to live a certain path. I also noticed that, maybe that stems from maybe two places. And there is a part of it in the sense of perhaps envy. And And I can admit the fact that, wow, that trip sounds wonderful. Like, while I don't feel comfortable spending on myself, I will admit that that does sound like an amazing trip. Thousands of dollars were probably spent on that trip, but it sounds like fun. And I will admit that that's probably part of it. The second thing I realize I admit is that in the work that we do, it also becomes more and more weighing. It weighs on you to surround yourself with lots of people with really wonderful hearts, but also understand that you are among them, and you can have compassion. And I feel like I don't judge them at all. Like, you have people maybe with drug problems or different kinds of situations, but the world judges them so much as it is. Like, there's no room in me to judge them. But then I also think that second part of the judgment that I have, maybe perhaps with my colleagues, is the envy that they don't see that. They're blind to that, which to some extent, ignorance is bliss. So it doesn't bother them. I don't know. I know I just kind of, it's very vulnerable right now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, Jessica, let me thank you first of all for that. And I understand how putting yourself in the position you're in, sort of out of the goodness of your heart, does raise these kinds of human emotions, be they envy over that trip to Galapagos, but also that sort of tethered to this tension of how do I justify spending that kind of money when there's so much need around me for basic essentials, because that would feel so superfluous and luxurious. One of the things I just want to encourage you to do is to keep doing that inner work. In other words, allow yourself just to keep existing in that struggle, because it itself is going to be teaching you a lot about the nature of the world, your place in it, and also to try to understand that you rightly named this sort of an aspect of what you're feeling toward colleagues would be envy, but also to rightly note that it is easy when we begin to do something that we really think is right. I'm deeply committed to my practice, or I've gone vegetarian or whatever, to become very self-righteous about that, and even if we're not actively becoming self-righteous, there is almost the tendency of our thoughts to move in that direction. Like, everybody should be doing this. This is the right thing. And how can people not see this? That's what's happening there is actually quite beautiful. And all I would say is, rather than try to make that go away, just to, in your meditation, allow yourself just to exist in the middle of it and know that's just part of human perception, emotional reaction, feeling the tension. In other words, grow comfortable with the tension rather than try to resolve it, because I don't know that there really is a way to permanently resolve it. And the good news is just that you're aware of those dynamics. And as I was saying to Richard earlier, by being aware of them, you can to some degree objectify them and then just notice, oh, I see envy rising. Okay, I know why, I get it. There's that. And I don't have to attach a lot to it. And I don't have to try to make it go away. Just by seeing it, I don't have to be responsive to it, right? I don't have to live as an envious person, even though I recognize envy arising in me, right? So that's, I think, one piece, just to allow your meditation to be the place where you can be at the center of that storm of emotions, and not of judgment, envy, all these things, struggle, compassion for the people you're working with, and just know that you have to kind of be present to all of that. And the other thing I would say to close is, how can I say, to recognize on some level that your very witness to what you're doing doesn't have to be a light put under a bed or under a basket. That, in other words, you don't have to preach to your colleagues what you're doing, but I wouldn't hide it out of a sense of false humility either, because that kind of humble, just expression of your lived experience could be the thing that inspires others to consider a similar way of thinking through their own financial lives or their own commitments. So humility isn't, I'm going to pretend that I'm not doing this. That's very different than just bragging or boasting, but being authentic about acknowledging, as you are on this venue, this is important to us. Here's why we do this. you never know. Somebody might ask to tag along sometime and just see what that looks like, right? So there's a way of just also preaching by embodying, right? And just allowing people to see that. And I also finally would say, one of the points I make in the book is, for any one of us, we can't do nothing and we can't do everything. That both of those have spiritual pitfalls that don't work. And that at some point, it might just be okay for you to save a little bit to go to the Galapagos and know that the world is going to go on, right? That kind of thing. So, and that other people are part of the solution, that you don't have to bear the whole solution of poverty in your city on your own shoulders, that it's a bigger issue. So those would be sort of ways I might help you just think through or pray through some of that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Father. And I think about, Jesus as someone that I follow, and he was with the poor, and he surrounded himself with just everyday people, but he was also very judgmental to the Pharisees and those that, he was very honest. And of course, and I'm not going to take that role. Absolutely not. That's not my place at all. But there is that part where, sometimes people, like, he needed to expose that when they were so blind to it themselves.
And I think the safest way to expose it is, rather than point a finger, is to live it authentically. And then people will see it. People are not going to miss the fact of the abyss between your own commitment and theirs. And who knows if that could then evoke inspiration rather than a sense of condemnation or guilt. And then that becomes the thing out of which they can potentially be invited into a more responsive life.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. It's beautiful. Thank you for that. Carl, please.
So several days ago, someone posted on our next door an experience that she had of walking down the street and seeing a homeless person, and she was about to just walk by, and then she was pulled into a connection that was so powerful. And and her story was an embodiment of the Christ within her that she couldn't even resist, because it was so much of what she is, not just in that moment, but that there was a kind of fulfillment of who she is in that encounter. And that was Christ in the world. And I think it's the acknowledgement of that in the comments to that little post were just full of spiritual awe. Mm. And so I think what you were saying about embodying the one's mission and not preaching, it can be very powerful. Mm-hmm. Just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I do feel that in different times and eras and locations, and the way we preach the gospel needs to be adapted. And I do really believe that we're in an age of radical pluralism and diversity. The most authentic means is this embodiment, rather than, the megaphones on the street corner. I just feel that people are looking for authenticity, and there's so many options of spiritual paths and ways of, right, that what's going to compel people is not if you scream at them or condemn them if they don't convert to your way of thinking or your religion or your spiritual master, but to really just live the radicalism as best we each can of the gospel. That becomes attractive to anyone who's really seeing. And that's not to say there's no time for conversation or inviting people into a community or witnessing to the gospel, but the heart and soul is our own embodiment of it. Yeah. Thank you for that call. Lucy, good morning.
Good morning. The insight that I had from the text that you shared this morning, I was wondering if I was right in thinking that there is a parallel with the substance of it, like there's a sort of a metaphysical movement of the consciousness, just like in the dynamics of centering prayer that is portrayed by Father Keating in the diagram where there's a movement between me having less activity on my part and letting the spirit grow predominantly, growing predominance of the spirit. In other words, the movement where the more I hand myself to God, the more the spirit comes to me. So it's the same with anything that in my deep inner self, could it be like, that's where I would like to take the sentence that deeper than horror is the joy. So in other words, it would be like letting go of everything that from my unconscious, that is horror, that is PTSD, that is bad memories, traumas, and exposing that. The more I expose that to the spirit and centering prayer, the more the spirit is cleansing that. So on a larger level in society outside, when I go in the world, that would mean that, or even don't have to go out, but in my mind, it's like the same thing. The more I open my heart to the people that I have a grudge against, or the more I open my heart to the things that I have a chip on my shoulder with, the more I let go of that, the more I can feel that my inner self is growing through the spirit and it's being cleansed. That's what I sort of heard from the text this morning. So maybe it sounds mixed up, but I'm trying to express myself as well as I can in English. Thank you.
Sure, Lucy, thank you. If I'm understanding correctly, I can respond maybe this way. We hear, for example, in a lot of the mystics, John of the Cross being, particularly say poignant example of the idea, for example, of, in the spiritual journey, you encounter a kind of dark night of the soul, and which he describes as God withdrawing the sense of presence from oneself and leaving oneself in this place of desolation, which can feel like agnosticism or atheism, just total darkness spiritually, and which some people eventually, and that this is sort of part of the maturation of a spiritual person. And that's all well and good, but I don't think that God actually withdraws. I don't think God ever, let me put it this way. If we take the way John of the Cross, for example, describes the spiritual life as God now manifesting consolation or presence, and then God withdrawing, and you experience desolation and so on, it almost sounds as if you attend to meditation long enough, God will do these things as part of the process. God will at some point withdraw, and then God will manifest again. And that feels like it's a very mechanical way of understanding divine activity. I think the reality is God is just simply always and everywhere present in the fullness of that sense. And what we experience as withdraw is part of our own spiritual development, and so forth, that God is actually not doing anything different. God is just radiating love. And we have to go through these stages of conscious development to move through anything in us that becomes a block to that. So in a sense, if I'm hearing your comment, your question correctly, then what's corresponding in the life of prayer is indeed, as Eckhart says, a removal of obstacles. The more obstacles we remove, the more conscious we become of our true spiritual identity and place within the divine economy, we would say, within the history of salvation. So the spiritual benefits that come with identifying envy or jealousy or anger in me, as we saw in that prayer of Thich Nhat Hanh, there is a corresponding awakening to what that wound or PTSD was ultimately masking in us. That's already at the core and at the heart. So, to use the phrase that Matthew Fox sort of, I think, popularizes, original innocence, whatever we call sin in the Christian tradition is that calcified way of being that's born of our woundedness and our traumas and our needs for various things. At the very core of that, before there's original sin, there is this original innocence that Adam and Eve participate in, this deep intimacy with God, that in a sense is what we long for still, and which in the book I talk about as having been ameliorated in Christ. So now the idea is simply to wake up to what God has already done. So there is definitely a corresponding freedom that comes, spiritual freedom, awakening, enlightenment, if you want to say, that comes from addressing these traumas, wounds, habitual behaviors. And as we free ourselves, we're able to expand into that reality. Did that respond to your question, Lucy?
Yes, that's especially the last sentence there.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks for your question. Welcome. Okay, let me then, seeing no more hands, let me take us then to our activity for the coming week, or the invitation to practice. And then I'll see if anybody has taken me up on this week's challenge and have a little conversation around that. So let me,
sorry. Whoops. Sorry. Whoops. I think I just.
There you go. Okay. So here's what I would, just to keep that clear, think of our contemplative practice right now for what I'm inviting us to in the coming week. Again, borrowing from the two prayers I took from Thich Nhat Hanh, which, by the way, appeared in a lovely context in the beginning of a book on contemplative practice, a contemplative prayer by Thomas Merton. And this particular version had an introduction by Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm laughing because this book used to be called The Climate of Monastic Prayer when I read it back in the early 90s. And when I was searching I actually pulled this book because I'm teaching a class on contemplative practice starting this coming Tuesday at USF. And I needed to pull some page numbers. Well, in doing that, I realized I had on my bookshelf literally 3 copies of the exact same book, all of which I've read and taken notes of, not realizing I had read it before. Once because it was under a different name, but in all cases. So I want to go back and compare the different stages when I read this and see how different my note-taking was. I thought that's ridiculous. In any case, contemplative practice for the week. Meditate on judgment and anger. How does it manifest in yourself? We talk about this idea, right, of I feel judged. What does that actually look like in you? Is it a feeling? Is that associated with thoughts? What do those thoughts actually say? How do they sound to you? Are they speaking to you? Are they silently speaking to the person you're being judgmental about? What does that look like? Like, attend to not just the concept of judgment and anger, but really how that gets embodied in you. And then, of course, I'd ask you to do the same. What is understanding and love, compassion and love, we might say, but I'm using Thich Nhat Hanh's language here. What does understanding and love, how does that manifest in yourself? And what I want you to attend to as you go through each of these is the really embodied experience of it, not the conceptual idea. All right, that's your meditation. I've already sent these to Joanne last night, so if you don't have them sent out by now, you will very soon. And with that in mind, let's take a look at the practice I asked you to consider for this week. And that would be to meditate on what it means to practice virtue in light of the revelation that you are already a member of Christ's body. So remember, we were talking last week about the ethical cart and horse idea. A lot of the times we calcify our ethical practices that become a way of trying to prove ourselves worthy to God, to win salvation in some subtle, half-conscious way. But we talked about really the opposite is true. It's first coming to the idea, as we'll hear in Paul very clearly in our readings tomorrow, if you're reading out of the Comment Lectionary or probably even the Roman Lectionary, this notion of Christ loved us while we were still sinners, right? So that the love comes first, and that gives us the capacity to look at this question of virtue. So meditate on what it means to practice virtue in light of the revelation that you are already a member of Christ's body. And as you consider the Christian moral life, what shifts when you cultivate a deep gratitude for being loved rather than a fear of offending God? How does that shift? So I wonder if anyone took up the challenge, and if so, you have the floor.
Oh, are we allowed to just talk? Oh shoot, I can't hear them.
Sure, Amanda, you can go right ahead.
Oh, is there a place where I'm supposed to raise my hand?
There is, but it doesn't matter. If you were to look, it depends on what version of Zoom you have, but if you look to the bottom
Okay.
of your screen, you might see
Oh.
something called reactions. And if you look at reactions, there's an option to raise hand.
Oh, I don't see reactions, but I know what reactions are. I guess since this is the first time I've been here, I just feel like I really was so touched by David's sharing. And it's a place for me that, like, all words end, and that level of compassion is, to me, I might not be sharing on the level that you're talking about, but like that's just so big for me. So just receive that, like for each of us to get to receive his weeping tears when he was at the table, just, and I guess so maybe in response to your question about oftentimes it's so easy to go from the place of like, oh, of judgment, and then at the same time we're being flooded like that. I don't know, it's something about that moment is healing, and I don't have the words for it, so that's what I wanted to share.
Well, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, the Desert Mothers and Fathers called that penthos, that moment where you're both aware of your incapacity to love as much as you're loved, and there's a certain mourning that comes with that because we so desire to love God as much as we recognize we're loved, as you talk about receiving those weeping tears. And yet it comes not only with a sense of mourning that we are incapable of loving as much as we're loved, but also the joy of how much, in fact, we are loved. This is this dynamic, and that can become a very transformational moment, because it isn't successive moments in which we feel both the mourning and the tremendous joy, but they become completely inseparable from one another. And a beautiful moment of sort of a breakthrough within our hearts where it can be just profoundly transforming. So thank you for sharing, Amanda. And Levon was asking about the name of the Merton book, that it was the Climate of Monastic Prayer, but was renamed posthumously, I think, as a Contemplative Prayer, because I think it was realized that the words he was speaking were not in the book, were not merely for monks or monastics, but for contemplatives. So it's the exact same book, but you can find it under both titles. Carl, please.
So your practice asks us to cultivate gratitude, and of course we're such intentional creatures that we know how to cultivate something. We just plow straight at it. But there may be a sense in which we don't, it's not such an active verb of cultivating, but of allowing just allowing the presence of gratitude within ourselves. There's a more, a less kind of aggressive or active way of letting gratitude shine through us because it's there already.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Carl, for that. I do, you know, as I mentioned earlier in the book, I really think that one of the wonderful and sort of difficult dynamics of meditation is to actively learn to become passive, to really learn to get out of the way and to allow the spirit to work through you. And it takes work to learn how to do that, to learn how to let go of control. And again, as I mentioned last week, don't think of this in a linear sense where you'll someday arrive at some perfect spiritual state. It's precisely in the thorns in our side that grace abounds. It is precisely in our foibles that God works in us. And so rather than seeking perfection, that goal-oriented sense of perfection, we just be present now, you know, where we are, and allow whatever that storm is within us to rage on, but you just stay centered through it. And that's the passivity that I think we seek. It's not a passivity that leads to complacency, but one that actually allows us to be more readily available to God. All right, thank you, Carl. Jennifer, please.
I didn't actually get to do the practice. Sorry, Father Vincent, I wasn't with you all last week, but it just, I was so struck. I feel like the quote that you have, the cross is the judgment of judgment, is so compelling and sort of gets to the heart of everything, and including your suggested practice for last week. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. It's in many ways, I think we've come to project a very negative image onto God when we think of God as supreme judge, you know, and we want to sort of shy away from that notion of God as the judge. Judge in Greek, krine, to judge, is to discern, is to separate weeds from wheat. It's what you do. It's to critically examine something to be able to judge, right? Is this a good essay or a bad essay? Is this a proper sentence or bad grammar, and so forth? So judgment, the problem with judgment is when we adopt a kind of attempt to impose a certain way of being on another person because we believe ourselves morally superior, or however that may be. But we have to understand that if we don't ascribe judgment to God as the only one who is capable of judging, of discerning, right, we end up with a theological and ethical impasse, which is to say, in what is right and wrong based, what makes something right or wrong. And if it's right or wrong of its own accord, rather than God being the source of that, what that does, even though we don't recognize it immediately, is to place some law, some moral or ethic above God, to which God now must conform. And that means that we've actually placed ethics and moral and judgment and right and wrong in something other than the source of all, as if to say then that the source of all now is beholden to that thing outside, that rule or that measure beyond the divine, which can't be. You end up with a real theological impasse to say that God is beholden to some law or code of ethics, what makes it right or wrong. And then you say, well, where did that come from? Who is responsible for that, right? In what is that right or wrong based that now God is beholden to? So from a strictly theological point of view, we are almost required to say that all good, all right, all wrong is grounded in the source of all being, which is God, and there can be nothing above God to which God is now beholden, right? And in that sense, we must ascribe judgment to God as the only one who could judge. And yet, okay, now with that premise, to understand the cross as, in a sense, the death of judgment, or the judgment of judgment itself, becomes the divine humility in which God says, the only premise for my judgment is my love, right? And I give my entire divine life in order that judgment itself would be not one that is grounded in divine thunderbolts or wrath or anger, but one that ultimately is born of divine love. And this is why I speak of the cross as both the judgment of judgment, but also the death of death, right? It is the death of death itself. It is the thing that renders death itself impotent, non-existent. And we know that the way in which Christianity has constructed the arch narrative of our salvation as a kind of rescue mission, the incarnation becomes somewhat of a rescue mission. Judgment and death, that is to say, sin and death, go hand in hand, one bearing the fruit of the other. And both of those become eradicated by divine will, because it's the only will that has the power to eradicate those. Divine will and divine love overcome the very reality of both of those, so that all that's left is mercy and life. Does that put that in a little, that's a little heady, but does that put that in perspective, Jennifer?
Yes, thank you so much. And it seems in some ways, and maybe I'm going a little too far, but in some ways the opposite of our judgment is understanding. And that's why you framed the contemplative practice that way this week, also to use Thich Nhat Hanh's words. But I just always remember he said, when you understand, you can't help but love. And that doesn't mean condone or, agree. It just means when you understand, when you have a sense of what it might be like to live in that person's shoes or whatever. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a similar saying also out of Buddhism, which in a sense is just said differently within Christianity, but it's the idea that wisdom leads to compassion, because wisdom is the awareness of the unity and oneness of all. And so when you and I become extensions of one another, being compassionate to you is an extension of being compassionate to myself. So it makes no more sense for me to harm you than to, cut my own arm off, or it's because there's just a deep unity. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh is saying the same thing, that there, understanding leads to compassion, wisdom leads to compassion. And indeed, this is what Paul is attempting to tell us in his whole analogy of the body. We are extensions of one another. Compassion for others really is an extension of the same compassion I typically hold for myself. Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. As always, great question. Christine, please.
Thank you. What's coming up for me are three short incidents that I will share with you. One is, I was on a trip to San Francisco. I stopped into Grace Cathedral in this beautiful side chapel. There was a priest giving a sermon, and he ended his sermon by saying, "So if you want to sin, go ahead and sin." And I'm blowing my mind. I'm thinking, here's a priest telling people to sin. What is that? And I went out wondering, what does he mean? And then having had my own deep fall from grace and being saved by God and loved by God and restored and healed by God, I then began to, when something would confront me and I would notice myself being judgmental, say, well, how is that like me? In other words, what is this mirror before me? And how do I rectify that? Or how do I deal with that in myself? Well, yesterday I was watching this interview between three very, very gifted, intelligent, sensitive men. And I found myself getting more and more irritated, a little judgmental. And what it was that they all stuttered. I mean, they stuttered to the point where they would have to have 5 attempts before they could get what they needed to say out. And I found myself thinking, oh my gosh, how does this happen? And are they feeding on one another's weakness or propensity to stutter? And I thought, oh, I either have to turn this off because it's upsetting me, or I have to sit here and realize the woundedness that caused the stuttering. And then it didn't matter what they were saying or trying to say. All I could see was how beautiful they are.
Thank you, Christine. I mean, that's a beautiful anecdote for how so much of what we do is a product of what we think. And when we can get beyond the thinking, which is what meditation is asking us to engage in, is to put thoughts aside, and with thoughts, judgments. What opens up is just a radically different experience of people, of reality, of grace. So much is based in the stories we tell ourselves, the judgments we make, and so on. Yeah, thank you. Sylvia, please.
Thank you so much for this and for everyone's sharing, as always. Last week, I spent a week in a deep meditation retreat and also training around collective trauma and death and dying and suicide and abortion and traumatic death. I mean, it was an incredibly intense week. And just two points. One for our homework from last week. One of the journal questions and then sharings we were given was, if today was your last day, and you were going to die at the end of the day, what is your greatest fear? And mine was that I would die disappointing God, that I had been given so much and so many blessings and lived in constant arising miracle since birth, and that I had spent so much of my life, including, however many minutes, hours a day now, not in the flow of the divine, of the awareness, of the bowing to the miracle, of all the things we're as contemplatives moving into. So that was my number one fear. And then my second one was that someone would have to deal with my garage. But anyway, but then the second thing I want to mention and then ask your feedback on was just now about this beautiful, I'm going to listen to this again, about judgment and the putting a divine law beyond God, which is a law that God would have to ascribe to. I got into a very intense conversation with a palliative care physician, and she is spearheading a movement against assisted death, against any legislative bodies or enactments of laws that would allow for physicians to assist someone who is terminally ill, has no hope of cure, is suffering horribly, and wants to leave before their natural time is up. And she is 100% against this under any circumstances, because it is going against divine law, natural law, and very passionate about this. And yes, of course, as with anything with life and death, there are potentials for terrible abuse. Of course there are. It's a human system. Any human system has potentials for abuse. Anything on the earth. I mean, fire can burn a house down. It can keep us warm, cook our food. So anyway, we had a very intense conversation about this. And I think you know this, that Lad, my husband, and I assisted 2 of our dearest friends who were in the most horrifying hell realm of tortured bodies, one end stage ALS, totally present and conscious. And you would never wish this suffering to continue for another 5 seconds for anyone.
Right.
And he begged us to help him and his wife and family. All, I mean, it was a beautiful death. And another one, same situation with Lewy body, and just extreme advanced Parkinson's. And he would have moments of lucidity where he would beg us to help him to get out of this torture prison he was locked in. And they were both gonna die soon anyway.
Right.
But anyway, so I'm interested to hear, this is a major application of what you were discussing earlier.
Right. I can try to respond to that, Sylvia. The first image that comes to mind when this debate is sort of raging around assisted suicide or dignified dying and all of this is 9/11. I was in New York on that day and saw things from relatively up close, and it's horrific and it's life-changing to be that proximate to that kind of devastation. And of course, what I think disturbed most people about that, as one of the top most disturbing sort of images, is what have now been called the jumpers. I growing up in the New York area, I was in those buildings many, many times. You are literally so high, it feels like you're, coming in for landing on an airplane. It's terrifyingly high, 90 to 100 stories. And it also gives you a beautiful purview of the city from being in the South. And I would always take friends there to start and then say, we're going to go to all those places. And then we'd get back down and start walking north. So I know those buildings intimately. And I understand what it feels like to be that high up in one of those buildings. So when we started hearing that day that people were jumping, this was just sickening on every level to me, because I understood the heights from which these people were plummeting. Nobody would call that suicide. We have to understand that. Nobody would condemn any of those jumpers for having prematurely taken their lives based on, look, let me put it to you bluntly. Whatever compelled those people to jump, you have to understand how high we're talking, how disturbing that is, and to understand that for them, that was the better option for whatever was happening inside the building. We know now that fires were raging at over 2,000 degrees. Floors were collapsing. It was a living hell. I don't know what it would take for me to have made that decision, how bad it would have to get where I'm like, yeah, you know what? Jumping out of a 90-story window is really the better option here. I can't imagine how bad it would have to be for me to muster that kind of courage, because it's pretty frightening. Isn't this question around assisted suicide that same scenario in slow motion?
Yes.
Is there not a point when we could say it is so terrible that to idolize life and suffering for its own sake, knowing it will lead to nothing redemptive, just death, the same death, is there not a point where we have to ask, is that just inhumane? Lewy body is a horrific disease. Lou Gehrig's, a horrific disease. And there is, I think, in the world, redemptive suffering that has a redeeming quality. But the torture and agony of a prolonged death for which there is no reasonable hope for any kind of recovery strikes me as cruel for anyone to ask somebody in that position to hold on for the sake of suffering and wait for the divine will to unfold. Any more than we could ask those jumpers to hang back in that living hell until it was God's time and God's way. It's just unimaginable, right? So I I feel very strongly that part of our society's idolization of life over and above quality of life, a meaningful life, just life, becomes problematic in this case, and that we really need to examine if there is a loving God who waits to embrace us and somebody is enduring incalculable suffering, whether that's in a burning building or because of the protracted agonies of Lou Gehrig's. Is there not some room for us to have an honest conversation about what it means for that person to die in a way that is peaceful, painless, dignified, surrounded by loved ones, when we know that that is inevitably the outcome anyway? I just think we have to give real attention to what we're asking. Those of us who don't know what it is to be in that kind of terminal situation and the suffering it brings, the agony of the psychological, emotional, physical suffering, to ask somebody to do that on our behalf. If somebody feels that they want to do that, I would support that. But I don't think it needs to be an ethical requirement in circumstances where there really is no reasonable hope.
Yeah.
I think it's cool.
Thank you. This is really beautiful. Thank you. Because in both of those cases, these were close friends, and we watched, in the beginning, oh, you're stumbling, you're bumping into things, you're slurring your words, what's going on? And we were with them the whole trajectory of the beginning, and obviously there at the last moments. And it's just so, I deeply appreciate your example of the horror of 9/11, because that's something I will use as a way of presenting this horrifying choice. Both of these men had beautiful lives and beautiful wives and beautiful families and the privileged of the privileged, and they didn't want to die. But there was it. Anyway, thank you so much for this. Your teachings and your presence and your passion and your gift to everyone is just, I'm so grateful. Thank you. And thank you to our group. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that very much. Yeah, it's a very painful and thorny issue, and it deserves a lot more attention than a simple rule-oriented approach. It's like everything. The question is, what in a given circumstance is the most compassionate thing? For those of you who've ever studied situation ethics, you know that it's based on the incapacity to judge something as ethical or not based on the circumstance, and sort of the image that's often put out is, if I have a buddy of mine and I cut off his leg, though that's clearly an unethical thing to do, I'm maiming him, harming him. But then when you put that in a situation of, well, we're in the middle of the trenches and he's got gangrene, if I don't do this, he's going to die, suddenly cutting off his leg becomes the ethical thing to do. So we can never judge apart from context and circumstances what is the right way forward. And very often we want to reduce our deeper ethical intuitions to rules. And we always run into trouble when we do that, because it's just simply, life is just more gray and complex than that, right? And I think if we're acting out of a place of compassion, that's a good start to know what's the right thing to do in a given moment. That's a good launching place. So thank you for raising what is, I know, a very complicated issue. So that brings us close to time. I want to thank you all for such heartfelt questions and your comments, as always. I'm off to do we're doing a poetry venue this weekend at St. Columba's with some wonderful poets on T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. So I'm be leading that or helping to host that in just a few minutes. So I want to thank you for being here again. And as you go this week, go, of course, and be healthy and be happy. Hold in your prayer, if you will, the person, life, and legacy of Thich Nhat Hanh, who really has gifted the world with so much beauty and insight around what it means to live a meditative, mindful life. So hold him in your prayer, if you would. And as you go with my blessing in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.